Hello, listeners. We are back with the 11th episode of AI Now, and we have with us today Aarthi S. Anand, Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, field expert in fintech, AI, blockchain, and digital currency. We are truly honored at having you with us today, and we look forward to a very interesting discussion. As I'm sure, and as I assure you, the listeners are sure we shall have. There's a lot of surety in that. Anyway, so right off the bat, let's get on with the questions. Aarti, with the rolling in of advances in 2021 with regards to the fintech infrastructure, how, in your opinion, will trade automation, trade performance analytics be affected?
Well, it's really interesting what you're bringing up. But before we jump in, I wanted to thank you and your journal for this opportunity. I've been following your podcast for a long time, so this is really fantastic to actually be here with
We honored.
folks today. Yeah, to jump into your question, the question of with regard to advances in 2021, where do we see automation, trade, performance analytics? I think we're coming off of the back of a really interesting year with 2020 and COVID and everybody globally going into work from home. You truly saw how AI can now begin to impact trade because there are now average consumers are no longer calling up their brokers and saying, hey, can you place a trade for me? Instead, they're all on these websites where they are actually engaging in trade. They are making the decisions. What do I sell? What do I buy? And this has like sort of two consequences. On the one hand, you are seeing enormous push behind newer technologies like Bitcoin, cryptocurrency trades coming in live in ways that you didn't really see in more traditional pre-tech markets. The second part that's also really interesting is that's coming up is with the average individual making decisions, you're also seeing much more volatility in the market. You saw the effect of COVID. You saw the average consumer responding to the Biden administration coming in. The run up to the elections, you could see enormous fluctuations. So I view it both as a challenge and as well as an opportunity that the average consumer is now coming into play live in a way that you didn't quite see earlier.
Okay. So now this is a very basic question, but I would like to ask this because most people are not really familiar with the concept. So, what exactly is sustainable wealth, and how do you think will it be data driven in 2021 and beyond?
I think that's enormously interesting because I tend to view sustainable wealth as sort of like two portions, right? One portion is it tends to be very values driven. The whole concept of sustainable wealth is saying, hey, this is not a one off. I'd like to be in this long term. So how do I make investment decisions that actually matches my values? And a second part to sustainable wealth, which is often conflated, is the concept of, hey, can I invest in green energy? So I would say there's sort of like twofold definitions. Most folks kind of look at the first part, which is it a values match? And to kind of dovetail into what I was earlier saying, because the average consumer is now far more engaged in his trade, he's now getting to buy, choose, really vote for his feed and determine what matches my values, which companies do I want to invest in, which industries would I like to invest in, what do I see is a match with my values. And I think that's going to become increasingly important and relevant because we've seen in the last few years enormous social upheaval, right? You've seen the Me Too movement. So you've seen average consumers turn around and say, I don't want to invest in companies which seem to view certain types of behavior, gender non-parity gender parity is a value for me. So women investors now coming in and saying, I want to invest in companies that uphold values. So I think that's where sustainable wealth really provides a great opportunity. The second part is when you ask about what it is, how it will be data driven in 2021. I think what's different about AI and fintech today is really earlier analysis was performed by the average broker. Now it is because technology has made it so salient, it's made the average consumer at a click of a button be able to determine what are the various factors that are in play. Now he can align his sense of values with investment. And I think that's where it's going to be really exciting. It's also going to push wealth advisors because if earlier wealth advisors will just go give generic advice saying, hey, these are the sort of companies I think you should invest in. Now the average consumer is looking at them and saying, yes, but that company doesn't align with my values. Give me companies that match my values. So that's where I think sustainable wealth could be a game changer in the next few years.
So it's not only about the CSR of the companies, but also about the culture itself.
Absolutely.
I guess the diversity and inclusion policies of firms and companies is something that comes in as a major player in this scenario.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're spot on. I think it's fantastic that it's consumers that are now forcing companies to really engage in good behavior, because companies now understand if they don't engage in certain sort of, if they're not taking steps to address race, to address gender parity, to address sexual harassment, to address climate change, their consumers are not going to remain with them. So I think that's what's really forcing it. So it's changing what we viewed traditionally as CSR. CSR was almost like additional advertising mechanism. Now consumers are telling them, I want to see that it's more real. I want you to show me actual output and results that you're driving.
So it's no more only pro bono cases, especially for the law.
Yes, Mridupal, you're putting me in a tight spot. It makes me wonder about my pro bono hours for the year. But yes, spot on.
Okay, so do you concur with the popular notion that customization and enhanced data tools produce the requirements for the wealth advisor's skill set?
Twofold. I think we've always had data, right? What is data? It's traditional data analytics has always existed. But the difference was it was your broker that was feeding in information and telling you which company is performing well by 10 years, 20 years, etc. And I think what's different now is the consumer is able to, at the click of the button, looking at websites, looking at tools, they already have that information. So now they're looking at wealth advisors and saying, what more can you provide to me? So I view it as sort of two trends. On the one hand, of course, there is now a pressure on wealth advisors, and it's something that Wall Street is increasingly talking about. How many consumers are moving away from traditional wealth advisors to utilizing, trading platforms where they can trade individually? But the second part is, I think, it's going to force wealth advisors to be more intelligent about their advice. Because your consumers now coming super educated to the desk and saying, hey, I can already see this company's 5-year performance, 10-year performance. Tell me what more can you provide? What value add can you provide that justifies me providing your brokerage, that provides me choosing to invest my portfolio through you? So I don't think it's going to eliminate wealth advisors. It's going to make them smarter, etc. And to be candid, this is sort of the same historic conversation we've had, right? When the Industrial Revolution happened, we were wondering, are machines going to replace human beings? Is the labor force going to go away? Similarly, you also have, like, in part 2, we wondered when AI has kicked in and autonomous vehicles have kicked in, you've said, are drivers and cars going to be a thing of the past? So I think this sort of question recurs in technology, but I wouldn't view this as hey, is it going to make wealth advisors redundant? No, but it's going to force them to give us intelligent advice to consumers.
So no more are consumers gonna get rich only on the paper, while brokers are getting richer in the physical world.
Well, I wouldn't say the transition's completely occurred, right? Because when you look at, for instance, the market fluctuations that happened in 2020 when COVID first hit, the truth was, because the market went into panic mode, actually speaking, when you look at the performance of Wall Street banks, they actually did really well in that period when individuals took a hit. Because every time individuals traded, when they sold or bought, the investment banks actually made tremendous money. So that occurs. But I think the difference now is going to be what you said. Wealth advisors are going to be forced to come up with better, more intelligent advice to consumers. So it's going to shift the balance of power, I think, to consumers. But I think it's going to take a little bit of time to arrive there. But I think that's definitely the way that it's the way of the future. We're going to see that more and more in the next year or two.
Well, I believe such an integration would definitely cause the laziness of the brokers to go away. If there's any, I don't want to be offensive. If there's any.
Absolutely. Spot on. In fact, you've sort of hit on the issue that I've also seen drive my career. Most recently, I've moved back into private practice for this precise reason, that now clients are coming to lawyers, to wealth advisors and saying, hey, give me more intelligent advice. And what's happening is now banks and investment bankers, brokers are now looking at lawyers and saying, hey, I need to provide a very different set of skills, a very different set of advice to clients. How do I go about doing this in a legal manner? Because the second part that comes up is when we're talking about enhanced data tools, something that we want to worry about is really regulations. To give you a simple example, think about this. A bank that has access to your credit cards information, that has access to your auto loans, that has access to your mortgage, has enormous data at its tips. Question is the bank going to allow for the data to flow into the pipes, come up with different analysis for you? Then banks, then the concern then is from a government regulatory standpoint. Just like the way government is going after big tech and saying, hey, the access that you have to data is different, so I want you to regulate it. I'm worried about the consumer's individual rights. It's one issue that you're going to see crop up. So that's something, even when you're looking at enhanced data tools that wealth advisors will have access to, it's something that I think the government is also going to start looking into closely in different jurisdictions. So I think it's going to be a bit of a balance. You're going to see new technology push in new data tools. Second, you're also going to see government regulated to make sure they safeguard consumers' interests. And third part is you're also going to see the impetus come from consumers to say, hey, I'd like to understand better what advice you're giving me.
Well, hopefully another subprime crisis does not happen.
Yeah, spot on. And Mridulpal, if there's anything that we've seen that COVID has taught us, it's that, right? Because 15 years ago, 10 years ago, if something like COVID had hit, we would have been in the middle of another recession. It was only because of technology and people could work from home, we really could literally prevent another subprime crisis, fueled recession that occurred. And I'm sort of truly grateful for all of us who are able to continue to have jobs to push through, because we are sort of, I think the human impact of something like that is just enormous. It's easy to talk in numbers, subprime, think of it as a subprime crisis or real estate economic issue, but how it impacts average person on the street. People lost jobs, people lost, livelihoods, people lost homes. So it's technology that's ensured in a way that COVID did not push us into another recession this time around.
Yes. So, what do you think will the biggest hurdles be with respect to the adoption of AI in fintech industry?
Well, I think that's a great question. Would it be all right if we sort of broke that into sort of two buckets?
Sure. Definitely, sure.
Yeah. So when I think of fintech, I think of it as two worlds. One is your banks, right? Those large banks that are bringing in technology to the play. And second set, which is like your fintech companies, which are the small startups. And this is where you're also seeing Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, etc. So there's sort of like two markets to it. And where you've seen AI already heavily deployed is in the crypto Bitcoin investment, where the average consumer is seeing AI tools being deployed at the back end to give them answers, to give them responses that's helping them make investment decisions. A second part is where how are banks using AI in fintech? And that's where I think it's getting very nebulous, because at the back end, banks are beginning to use AI. Question is, how much is the government aware of it? How much are they aware of the type of data that is literally flowing through the pipes of these different banks? How, the government has gone after the large tech companies, but how are they going to examine the data that's, held by these banks? These raises very complex questions. And to me, what's been really interesting is I've now moved into private practice. I work at a law firm called Perkins Coie. Perkins coincidentally has over 100 lawyers who specialize in AI for the reason that you mentioned, because it's very complicated questions. It impacts fintech. It also impacts the average investor making decisions in, do I want to invest in autonomous vehicles? Do I want to invest in green energy? Another issue that we've seen crop up now with regard to AI is with the Biden administration pushing for climate change. Carbon markets are getting very active now, and AI is deployed very heavily there. Because, for example, one of the reasons why the EU ETS market failed last time was cybersecurity. There was a big InfoSec hack. So now the question really is, if we can deploy AI in these areas, our ability to succeed in markets that we failed at earlier or didn't quite succeed in earlier, it could change the story. And I think that's where it's going to be really interesting this coming year.
Yes, especially when you refer to the government's regulatory organizations over AI. One thing that comes to my mind right off the bat is the fact that Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas employs AI and private security teams, and that is not under the purview of the government.
Well, I think to be fair to the governments, like technology is so new, right? And literally, governments are forced to like now pull up their socks and try to understand what's happening before they decide whether to regulate it. And if they decide to regulate it, how do they go about doing it? Truly, the technology currently is so ahead of the curve. Both as consumers, average regulators, we're all trying to play catch up when you're talking about not just Caesar's Palace, right? Literally every industry is having enormous data sources. If you look at, for instance, vehicles have now literally they have a laptop in the machine. So they have enormous data sources. They have Wi-Fi in there. So my car is able to provide information to my car manufacturer on what I'm searching for, where am I going, what purchases am I making. So you're spot on. These are raising very hard questions for government. And a second complicated issue is the globalization of technology, right? Like, for instance, one is seeing if the US goes after, the risk is some other country which doesn't regulate it as heavily is where companies will switch to. For instance, right now you're having London, New York, Singapore. They've created sandboxes. So how the government is approaching it is saying, hey, I'll create a sandbox where the newer fintech companies can come in, test drive technologies in a way that the government has some oversight, has some understanding of what are you doing, so that before you go and put it out in the outside world, I get some sense of what are the implications. But what you said, Mridutpal, is like spot on in terms of it raises really hard questions because it's about technology, it's about data, whose data is retained. And when you combine the data, what stories does it tell about the consumer?
Okay, so what do you think will have the greatest impact on the financial markets in 2021?
Um, huh. I think that's literally asking me to sort of look at tea leaves. But I truly think twofold, right? Like, again, to sort of look at what have we seen in 2020. In 2020, I would say two big issues that cropped up, right? We had a global pandemic. So we initially thought we were going to head into a recession. So we saw the world over face a big global healthcare challenge. And you saw all the pharma companies rise up. And what's really interesting is how technology partnered with these pharmaceutical companies, and not only in the development of vaccines, but now when we are thinking about how are we going to have these distribution channels world over. So when you're asking me in fintech, I would say twofold, right? Increasingly now, folks are going to be looking at pharmaceutical companies to invest in. Second piece is that when we've learned lessons from the COVID year, right? Like we've learned, okay, there was some amount of market fluctuations. We saw weeks when the markets went into a nosedive, but you very quickly saw a resurgence of consumer, or rather an average investor's faith in the markets come back in. You saw the market come back. And I think that's what's really going to be interesting. So going into the next year, we're going to take the lessons from the COVID year and say, hey, now the average consumer sitting at home has had significant time to understand financial markets, ask questions of their wealth advisors. So I think where we're really going to see, I would say two trends I can see coming into the next year. One, you're going to see consumers continue this trend of investing on their own. So you're going to see the financial trading platforms that allow the consumer at a click of a button to buy, sell, trade continue to be far more live than they were in the past. Second trend that I can see is the emphasis on which companies, which industries that the consumer will be interested in will change. It's going to be Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies. It's going to be pharmaceutical companies. Third, I'm also going to be very interested in seeing the average consumer invest in climate change, carbon trading companies. Those I see as the big trends coming up the following year.
Okay. So how far do you think the general public will be accepting of digital financial coaches or advisors?
Now you're putting me in a really tight spot. To be candid, that's still a fairly heavily regulated industry, right? Whether it's in London or New York or Bombay, this is an area in which the government has been super careful about protecting consumers and saying, hey, I want you to go through registered broker dealers. So that is going to continue to be the trend because I think are looking to protect the average consumers. So that's one portion of it. With regard to digital financial coaches and advisors, so the question is, are you going to use these what do you mean by digital financial coaches? Are you saying that these registered broker dealers are increasingly going to be providing advice through digital mediums? I could see that occurring. But if we mean plain vanilla, the newer folks who are sort of just appearing, mushrooming on the internet on their own, I would be a little bit more cautious there. And because I think that's an area that there's a reason why it's regulated. So you're not going to really see mushrooming of digital financial advisors on their own. But I get your point, Milipal. I think coaches is like a great mechanism. Like if you could have financial coaches come in, then the average consumer is no longer just having a choice of like 3 or 4 financial advisors or brokers they could go to, right? Now they have the internet. They can get advice from coaches across the world. And second, what I'm going to be really interested in is to see if investors are going to increasingly we've seen globalization. Are investors increasingly going to be making investments and inroads into financial markets of other countries? I think that's where digital financial advisors and coaches could play like a far more important role. So an average shareholder or an investor sitting in India could potentially be investing in companies in the United States. They could invest in Bitcoin, crypto exchanges in the United States. Similarly, a US investor could be interested in investing in the Asian markets. So I think that's where the digital financial coaches could be super helpful. They could come about opening up markets that were hitherto sort of close to the average investor.
Well, what about if these digital financial coaches or advisors are indeed chatbots and not real people?
I think you've sort of identified the issue that's cropping up on all our websites, right? I think those chatbots raise interesting questions, right? Because it's not a human being. Until now, regulators have felt, hey, if a broker provides you like advice without the safeguards, you knew whom you could go after legally. With chatbots, whom do you go after? The coder who programmed it, the website who provided the service, or really like whom?
Like same as autonomous cars.
Exactly. Right. And so that's sort of like when chatbots are sort of interesting, right? But I think chatbots still have their use. I don't want to say it's completely useless because I think where they could help is not in making a decision on whether I invest in this company or not, but it could answer some basic questions that I'd like without having to spend time talking to my wealth advisor to get a basic understanding on what type of company is this. For instance, a chatbot could very easily give me data on the last 5 years performance, the last 10 years performance, give me really simple basic information. So I think chatbots could be used for that, but I wouldn't view chatbots as sort of the solution for data analytics, if that makes any sense.
Okay. So, uh, how, in your opinion, will AI affect transaction search and visualization?
I think that's an area in which we are already seeing AI have a huge impact, right? It's one of those areas that I think is low hanging fruit for AI. When I'm thinking of transaction searches and visualization, until now, literally, right? Like if I'm thinking back 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when I first started investing, I would have my wealth advisor really have to dumb it down for me. They could have the fancy PowerPoints, but I would literally say, I would be relying on them to tell me which companies do I make investment in, what's sort of my 5-year, 10-year plan. But I think where this is an area where AI could be super useful for transaction searches and visualization, because now the AI is able to take in the 5, 7, 10 factors that I would care about. Second, it's also able to insert not just 1 or 2 factors. Earlier, if you had one human being, that person's expertise could be, say, an understanding of the Bombay Stock Exchange or the New York Stock Exchange, or they would have an understanding of one industry. Now, the difference with these AI tools is they can plug in the 20 or 30 data inputs. Okay, wait, where are companies letting go of employees? So that's where mortgages could be affected. So then it could literally already plug that in and tell me, hey, don't invest in real estate in Wisconsin. That's why we're seeing a lot of companies beginning to file warn notices. So that's where I think AI could be really useful. It could take in hundreds and thousands of data units and put it in and give me like a more logical story in ways that human beings would have found a lot harder. If earlier we could take in like 5 factors, now it allows us to take in 100 different factors, both at the global level, at the national level, at the regional level, at the industry level. And second, it can also add in factors that are more individual specific, right? Like what is my age group? What is my retirement plan? What is my wealth portfolio? And it can really club it to come up with like a portfolio that's a more tailored, appropriate answer for me. So I think you've sort of identified an area where AI has the maximum impact currently.
Well, since we already have talked about the subprime crisis, do you think client risk profiles will be more effectively framed with the advent and implementation of AI in fintech?
Um, Absolutely. Because what I love about AI really is it makes us re-question our assumptions on data, right? To give you an example, I did a study a few years ago where I started with a presumption that IP is critical to the technology industry. And once we started collecting the information on where has industry grown, Silicon Valley, Boston, India, have IP laws changed? Have they fueled the IT industry? You kind of realize the data did not support our premise. And similarly, when I interviewed CEOs, I realized, wait a minute, these folks were giving away these provisions at the negotiating table. So then our fundamental presumption that neoclassical economics, that if you increase property rights, it'll drive technology, didn't actually hold good in the technology industry. And that's where I think AI is super interesting because as a client, I could tell my wealth advisor my risk, you know what, my risk appetite is actually moderate. I really don't have a high risk appetite. This is what I want. This is what I don't want. But what I often may not be articulate is my biases that come in. I'm making assumptions that I'm a moderate risk taker. Actually, I may be a higher risk taker or I may be a lower risk taker. So having access to my portfolio information and my profile gets an investment advisor to actually give me better advice that says, I know you think you're a moderate risk taker, but actually speaking, when I'm looking at your portfolio, most of your portfolio is in debts. So we can actually increase your portfolio in the equity markets. And I can also see that a more international profile will reduce the risk in yours. So how about doing that? So I think that's where AI provides like great information. It makes you question the biases. It helps you make sense of the data and come up with answers that are actually a little bit more accurate than we could typically assume if we were just talking one-on-one.
Okay, so how do you think the lives of brokers and securities firms will be affected by the advent and implementation of AI in fintech?
I think we've already seen it hugely affected, right? The last year. To be candid, when I speak to friends of mine who are brokers and wealth advisors in different countries, you can virtually see them saying, hey, there are folks now investing through M1. They are investing through Robinhood. They are investing through all these, financial markets that are available online. They are on their own going and investing in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. Earlier, like you would have the average investor talk to the wealth advisor and say, I really want to be safe. Tell me which are the gilt-edged securities. Now, the average investor is going to your investor and saying, hey, I want great returns. Tell me, how do you get me great returns in 2 years, in 6 months, in 9 months? So I think that's where the implementation of AI in fintech is going to change. It's already changed the lives of brokers and securities firms. And two is it's also keeping them honest, right? So earlier, if a broker were to say, Oh, I would tell you this. Now you're seeing the consumer push them back. Say, I know you're telling me to advise in this company, but I'm actually seeing their performance. I'm not too happy with their performance for the last 2 years. Why aren't you instead opening up these sectors to me? Why aren't you instead talking to me about these? So, what you're also increasingly seeing is collaboration behind the scenes. Brokers are now forced to go back, get more advice from their colleagues in order to respond to consumers. And I'm sort of seeing this even as a lawyer. I'm seeing clients ask these questions of their brokers. I'm seeing brokers forced to respond to this. So banks are also now coming back to lawyers and saying, hey, I'd like to get more creative about my recommendations to the consumers, but how do I do so in a manner that I'm not going to bump up against financial regulations? So I think that's going to be an enormously exciting area. We're already seeing consumers. It's really putting the consumer now in the driver's seat. The consumer, the investors now making the decisions, and now they're asking questions of their brokers and wealth advisors. So I think it's going to see a fundamental shift in the way markets operate.
Well, and then the best friends the consumers have are lawyers. So there's that, and therefore something good is gonna happen to the legal industry, I guess. So last but not the least, what in your opinion is the pathway that India should adopt in order to ensure that India does not lag behind in the fintech industry?
I think that's just such a great question because think about it. Like, I think if there's one country that has benefited most from the technology in industry and from the technology revolution, it's India, right? We've fundamentally changed. Like, I was born in the 80s in India. When I was growing up, technology was just beginning in India. I remember my uncles like joining the technology industry, and the first set of goals used to be to sell one laptop or sell one computer. To now, it's like India is literally fueling the technology industry globally. So I think the second challenge, or what I think of as technology 2.0 for India, is going to be, we already saw part shift from BPO to the IT models, but I think the fundamental shift is going to happen in 2.0. India, I think, is super well positioned to take advantage of the fintech industry because India was the country that cracked the technology industry, right? If the US produced its Googles, Facebooks, etc., it was fueled and backed by the Infosys, TCSs, and Wipros. So that's where I think India can really make a difference is in 2.0 of the fintech industry. But what's the reason I want to be a little bit cautious there is India has been a little bit slower on sort of like getting into the startup space, getting into the fintech space. And I think that's an enormous opportunity both for the large technology companies as well as the startups that have been supporting a number of banks. But the third part that I'd like to truly see for India is when you ask me what is the pathway for India, when we saw demonetization occur in India, we've seen a huge financial experiment. So if we could see the government encourage the Bitcoin cryptocurrency industry, combine that with India's strength in the technology industry, I think that's an area in which India has enormous opportunities, but it's an area in which India hasn't been as active as other countries, like say even a Singapore or a Hong Kong or London or New York. So I think that's an area in which India's been tad lagging, but we could play catch up super easily because we have the fundamental building blocks. So that's where it would be super exciting to see India step up. I'd love to see a new Robinhood come out of India. I'd love to see a new Gemini fund come out of India.
Well, here's to hoping that India does surpass China in the race for, let's say, AI armament. Uh, so here we are wrapping this up. This has been great. We have really enjoyed it, and I've got a few messages that say that the listeners are really enjoying this. So this was really fun. So listeners, we are gonna be back again soon enough. We have got a few more episodes before we wrap up this season, and trust me, they are gonna be fun. Uh, so thank you, Avivardhan sir, for letting me have this session. Thank you. Godspeed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pal, for this opportunity. It's been wonderful talking to you today.